The news media, they won't cover it. Your politicians and leaders are not going to admit it, but there's no denying it now. We're in the second year of what is effectively a world war. That might come as a shock to some and obvious to others. The Cold War has exploded into a hot war on multiple fronts worldwide, with more hot zones being potentially dragged in shortly. Your nation's treasures flow into this war, and your soldiers might eventually be directly engaged. In this video, I'll explain how this world war is like no other we've ever seen, how it might never end, and what you should be paying attention to now with how you prepare to give yourself the greatest chance of enduring it. There's a lot to analyze and explain here, so let's dive in. Different wartime economy. In the previous world wars, countries committed resources, retooled their factories, and recruited a fighting force of citizens in their armies. Countries adopted what came to be known as a wartime economy. For example, before World War II, factories in the United States turned out automobiles, large and small appliances, and children's toys. In January 1942, a mere month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the establishment of the War Production Board that would press these factories into the war effort. Even before this, industrialists were pressured into moving away from their civilian industrial efforts to build instead ships, tanks, and planes for the war effort. However, this world war is different because it is mainly supplied through surplus, trade, and bribes. You can see this most clearly in the flow of 155mm shells, the preferred weapon of choice in this war. When Russia was burning through its supplies, firing an estimated 40,000 of these explosive rounds daily, they turned to North Korea to supply them with millions more. Ukraine is firing upwards of 8,000 of these rounds daily and has been supplied by the United States with more than 1.5 million rounds already. To ship that many, the United States has agreed with South Korea to source 500,000 of the rounds. Only recently has the United States Army sought to ramp up their own production of the shells sixfold to 85,000 a month. There is a point where supplies and trades are insufficient to supply the war zone, and a wartime economy adequately has to be adopted. Still, economies are very different today than they were 3/4 of a century ago at the end of World War II. And it's not just 155mm shells, though those are the most obvious to track. The flow of wartime parts is coming from all over the world. Russia is being supplied with bearings for their tanks from China and Uzbekistan. Without the bearings, Russia's war and ability to supply it would immediately end. Without bearings, there are no more Russian railways or tanks. China has also provided rifles, body armor, and drones. Egypt had secretly planned to give 40,000 missiles to Russia before their efforts were disrupted. North Korea and Iran have provided weapons and personnel to operate them. The US is providing targeting reconnaissance to Ukrainian forces, and billions of dollars of weaponry have moved into Ukraine from NATO countries. Many of these weapons, like missiles, have ranges that far exceed anything used in previous world wars, and we've already seen where they have fallen in countries not directly involved in the conflict. Any one of these instances could result in an immediate escalation of the conflict. In a way, your country is already adopting a wartime economy even though there is no official declaration of war, and you may not have boots on the ground in the war zone. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and fears of China pushed military spending to a record high in 2022 throughout Europe and America. With previous wars, citizens were mobilized to collect resources in the war effort, sell bonds, save aluminum and rubber, and work in factories to support the effort. And while countries haven't come to that level of mobilization at this point, in a way, we are feeling this impact. LNG exports from the United States to Europe have increased a staggering 141% to support allies in Europe cut off from Russian liquid natural gas. That creates a supply imbalance in the United States and has forced the prices up, requiring consumer conservation efforts. So, the wartime economy of the past may look different today. However, like it or not, your country is slowly adopting a wartime economy. New soldiers in World War III. World wars of the past required countries to send their sons, daughters, and treasures overseas to other countries to fight with boots on the ground. When one side lost too many sons, daughters, and treasure, wars would end with a victor and a defeated. Technology and stockpiles of ordnance collecting dust have changed that dynamic. The Wagner Group, a private mercenary group that takes its orders directly from the Kremlin, is currently being led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's close friend. The United States Treasury Department designated the Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization. Now, one of the reasons they did this is because they are functioning beyond international rules and laws. They're recruiting prisoners under duress from Russia. It's far from a disciplined fighting force apt to follow established international codes of conduct. Though private military companies, or PMCs, are officially banned in Russia, the Wagner Group is directly employed and funded by the Kremlin. Think of them as Putin's personal brute squad. The Wagner Group allows Russia to enact foreign policy beyond any accepted international laws, rules, or norms. Countless allegations, video evidence, and sworn testimonials reveal this group frequently tortures and murders civilians and prisoners of war. Now, obviously, this violates the Geneva Conventions. Russia can and does deny having any part of these human rights violations because, if true, the actions were taken by a contractor, not the Russian Federation. The group has sought weapons and ammo from Turkey and other countries. PMCs are not unique to Russia. Think Blackwater. But Putin has definitely leveled them up and removed a layer of accountability with the Wagner Group. The mere existence and scope of this PMC makes comparison to previous world wars problematic. There is no wave of national army storming beaches or skirting the Maginot Line. Instead, ununiformed infiltrators and saboteurs are crossing borders and engaging in subterfuge meant to destabilize other countries. The fall of Crimea was preceded by an invasion of unknown armed men, often referred to as Little Green Men, who were later proven to be Russian soldiers. The tactic works, and Putin uses it to his full advantage to wage war with impunity worldwide. It's worked so well that PMCs may one day replace the standing Russian army if it hasn't already. It can be assumed when the Wagner Group receives too much bad publicity on the world stage that they're going to be absorbed into some different PMC formulation. Blackwater, after all, is on its third name change. This matters to you because, like it or not, there's a world war being waged through these PMCs. Members of these groups can be in any country where they can gain assets or recruits. Typically, they're actively recruiting from any country that harbors anti-Western sentiments. This should matter to you because they are in any country where Putin has the intention of creating chaos or destabilization. The Wagner Group is even seeking to recruit fighters in European territories and around the globe for what it dubs a mystery plan. Any way you examine it, it is a state-sponsored terrorist group that is larger, better funded, and more organized than Al-Qaeda ever was. And that should be a concern to you. If a country doesn't have its own sons and daughters with boots on the ground in the conflict zone in the past, it couldn't say it was involved in war. That's no longer a defining characteristic of the soldiers in this war. Ever escalating and never ending. When a war is waged with shadowy entities like private military groups, when a war is funded through surplus, shady deals, exchanges, and promises, when countries commit to the war effort by rechanneling their resources and treasures to it, when a war involves multiple countries on multiple secret fronts, it meets the definition of a world war. The part that should matter most to you is that this is an ever-increasing conflict that can have no resolution short of the collapse of one of the major parties: Ukraine, Russia, the United States, Europe, or China. One of these significant entities imploding or changing leadership could destabilize the concentrated war efforts long enough for a single victor to emerge. Short of that outcome, however, where does a war like this really stop? Cyber attacks and destabilization efforts escalate. These attacks and the chaos they create move far from the war zone and impact people and operations worldwide. More front lines in the war emerge, though at first glance, they seem unrelated. Already it's surfacing that the Wagner Group is a crucial player in the conflict in Sudan. In fairness, this is a long-standing generational conflict in Sudan, but the Wagner Group's fingerprints are clearly on this chapter of it. The two warring generals have been supplied by the Wagner Group. Russia has secured mining rights to the Sudanese gold mines and is in agreement to build a Red Sea naval base. The problem is that to build a naval base, parliamentary approval is required, and Sudan would need to form a civilian parliament first. The machinations of democracy take longer than Russia is willing to endure, but whichever friendly, Wagner-supported, warring general seizes power, and regardless of what genocide takes place with Wagner-supplied weapons, an authoritarian general is much more likely to approve a Russian naval base than a freely established parliament. Russia, China, and the United States are still bribing allegiance, support, and passive acceptance of their policy and actions from smaller countries at this point. For instance, Russia is poised to deliver, free of charge, up to 500,000 metric tons of grain to the poorest nations of Africa in the coming months. For Russia, it's a rerouting of grain that they can't sell elsewhere to buy goodwill and support in world organizations. Indeed, the fires of the front lines of this world war have sprung up elsewhere, far beyond Ukraine. And Putin would love for the attention to be taken off of Ukraine and paid to any other location in the world, so expect more of these conflicts to rise anywhere poverty, famine, or political destabilization exist. At the core of these conflicts is the same theme: genocide, authoritarian leaders, murder, political instability, and establish borders that can all be ignored so long as influence and profit can be garnered. It is a very different world order than the sometimes messier democratic Western ideas. Expect the allies of Russia, like Iran, will redouble their efforts to fund terrorist efforts around the world. You can expect more resource-rich but unstable countries to develop internal strife and conflict suddenly. A destabilized world is part of the Russian plan. Expect attacks on infrastructure or computer networks or banking systems where no clear culprit can be identified. For instance, Chinese cyber attacks on NATO countries have increased by 116% since Russia invaded Ukraine. Linking the culprit back to a specific government will be difficult even when the culprit can be identified. In an ever-escalating conflict like this, can peace ever be restored? If the conflict in Ukraine ends, will the private military companies just disband, or will they be absorbed into other cells, fights, or conflict zones? If the world puts out one fire, does it simply spring up somewhere else? If there is ever peace restored to Ukraine, what about Sudan? Will we see the front lines in this amorphous conflict grow even further in Moldova or one of the other 26 countries where Russia is alleged to have been meddling politically? With a large portion of your country's resources being channeled into a war effort somewhere else, is it just a matter of time before your country's troops are directly pressed into a conflict? What can you do? Make no mistake about it, World War III, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much underway, though it doesn't really conform to our current understanding of past world wars. This one won't go away as easily and may never really have a clear victor. Your nation's treasures and resources will likely continue to pour into the conflict, and the war is shaping up to be an ever-escalating and really never-ending war. Your economy is transitioning to a wartime economy because if it doesn't, your country will lose the war. Now, knowing this, there are things that you can do now, even as the government pretends it's not actively engaged in a world war. And because they're not admitting this reality, they aren't going to ask you to start a victory garden. However, the ever-escalating and never-ending conflict may disrupt food supplies. And the facts are that some food supply lines will be disrupted as trade agreements are challenged. Food resources are allocated elsewhere, where agriculture and shipping are challenged. Now, just the brewing conflict with China and their warming up to Russia through trade deals and BRICS should call into question the stability of any food sourced from China. India, China, and Russia, they all have been hoarding grain for the last several years. We did a video on this, I think about last year or 2 years ago on the channel. Now we know the reason was probably the war in Ukraine and the rising tensions in the South China Sea. If there ever really was a time to free oneself even a fraction from global food supply chains to source more locally or even grow some of what you eat, this would be the time. You should also take a critical look at your work and income. Your employment might suffer if it isn't somehow tied to the war effort. For example, if you work in the service industry and your nation's resources are leveraged in a war effort, the economy suffers and fewer people seek services. If you work for a company that manufactures anything with source parts from other countries, that part supply could dry up or be diverted to the manufacturing efforts. For instance, if you want to buy anything made of steel, consider how much steel is used for a 155mm projectile that weighs 103 pounds. Now multiply that by the over 1 million shells per year the US is ramping up to produce. And then you can begin to imagine that steel for buildings, cars, washing machines, refrigerators, and even surgical scalpels may be in reduced supply, thus driving up their costs. The war effort has already impacted the aluminum industry, one of Russia's chief exports, as evidenced by the recent executive order from the White House imposing tariffs. Now, this is already happening right now. And what will be the new price of anything made from or packaged in aluminum as a result? You can anticipate more shortages and higher costs as more resources flow to the war zones and away from your country. And by extension of that, you can expect that your economy will probably continue to backslide and move deeper and deeper into debt with decreasing currency valuation. Basically, you'll need more money, which will buy fewer goods. The dollar's value will decrease proportionally to the alternate currencies and exchanges, and inflation is going to continue to climb. I would encourage you to treat your finances as part of your preps, as we often encourage here on this channel, and really cultivate your skills and knowledge while you still can, and that's the key. In the future, your ability to gain new skills and knowledge, it may not be as easy, but however, these will prove invaluable to your future self if conditions continue on the same path. Now, in some ways, the world has really always been at war, a war of political ideologies, a Cold War, and smaller revolutions and conflicts, and that hasn't really changed. But what has changed is the prominence and concentration of these conflicts. What has changed is the cold distance from which nations can now recruit, engage in conflicts, and absolve themselves from any wrongdoing or atrocities committed on the battlefield. And eventually, the war will not be sustainable from afar, with dusty stockpiles of decades-old weaponry. Eventually, to be victorious, countries must commit to boots on the ground or step aside and let someone win without their participation. Make no mistake about it, we are really engaged in a world of epic proportions right now. And you should also prepare for that just as your ancestors did, even if your government still needs to acknowledge this fact. As always, stay safe out there.